Hey guys, I'm Nadav. The next 10 minutes, I do work in IoT, but the next 10 minutes basically have very little to do with my day-to-day work at Bell, so I hope you enjoy. Today I'm going to tell you guys a bit of a story about a time that I failed over and over and over again. A while ago I bought this cheap security camera. I thought it'd make a fun little project out of like hacking it and kind of digging into it. I had also just gotten broken into, so I was feeling extra paranoid, so I decided I wanted to see what the security looked like. This is my ideal IoT security camera. It's one that doesn't spy on me, that's convenient to use, and that doesn't spy on me. So I set off to see like how secure is this thing really? And so I said, okay, can I SSH into it? And the answer was no. And then maybe Telnet, and the answer was no. And then I said like, okay, cool. Are there any ports actually open on this box? No. But I wanted to dig a bit deeper. And thankfully I wasn't the first person to have that same thought. And I came across a project on GitHub that basically produced a modified version of the firmware with SSH added to it. All I had to do was put the new firmware images onto the camera's micro SD card, and on boot, those files get copied over to the camera's internal storage, and giving me a root shell and that glorious screen that you see before you. After a little bit of digging through the camera, I found some kind of interesting strings in it. I've highlighted like the most interesting one, which is basically this one right here, which is that it looks like the camera's video files get uploaded over HTTP to what's basically like a shutdown file sharing site in China, and that's not necessarily my definition of secure. So I set up to make it better. I wanted to make it more secure, and the first thing I needed to do was a way to watch for file changes on the file system, because a new file is written when motion's detected. And after I have a new file, I can, and a change occurs, I can trigger an HTTPS request to the server of my choosing. So basically, I have InotifyWait that watches for file changes on the file system. When it does, I can use curl with SSL to send it to the server that I choose. Unfortunately, though, the camera doesn't have every utility that you need to do that. So I had to compile my own binaries. I had to compile InotifyWait, and I had to compile curl with SSL support. My one stroke of luck, though, came in the form of an SDK. But that's kind of how using that SDK felt. It sucked. After about a day of struggling and failing to install the SDK or compile anything at all, I finally, barely managed to install the SDK and compile my two binaries. And then I had to actually get those binaries onto the camera, and this is where things kind of started to spiral out of control for my project. So this is what the camera's storage kind of looks like. There's an external micro SD card which stores like full-length recordings, things like that, and there's an onboard SPI flash strip that's 128 megabits, and it stores the bootloader, the kernel, the root file system, and the home file system. The thing is, to keep costs down, the manufacturer made the flash chip, the internal flash chip, really, really small, and it basically only has enough size to keep the firmware. That 128 megabit flash chip is only like 16 megabytes, which doesn't leave much room for the binaries that I compiled. So I needed to free up some space. And what I did was I thought I'd delete some files that I thought the camera might be able to live without. And I was really, really wrong. I bricked the camera and it wouldn't actually boot anymore. So I took what I thought would be the next obvious logical step. Because I lost my root shell and I had no way of accessing the file system, what I decided I would do would be to take the camera apart so I could then manually reprogram that flash chip. And so I could then fit my binary so I could then make that camera finally secure. I tried connecting test clips to the flash chip that you see right here. It's pretty tiny. No luck, I couldn't read the flash chip. I wasn't sure though that the camera circuit wasn't affecting my ability to read it. A few weeks before all this started, I got myself this cool little CNC mill / laser engraver. The idea being that eventually I could make my own circuit boards from my apartment and do other kind of like laser cutting projects and things like that. I hadn't actually had a chance to use it yet, so I figured what a better time to learn than when you're neck deep in another project. And down that rabbit hole I went. With that new mill smiling from across the room, I said, yeah, okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna desolder the chip from the camera, I'm gonna make myself a little adapter board, solder it on, so then I can manually reprogram it, so I can so I could then fit my binaries, and so I could then make that camera more secure. And this is what the adapter looked like. It's a little rough, but it's actually a decent first attempt. I started up a tool called FlashROM after that, and it interfaces with the programmer that actually reads and writes it to the chip. Before I could restore that old firmware, I had to actually see that I could read the chip. But no luck even there. After desoldering and resoldering the chip, I couldn't even detect it. I really didn't know what else to do. I wasn't sure that I hadn't blown the chip up, and I was pretty defeated, so I said screw it, and I put the camera back together. And as I was putting that final screw back in the camera, this like huge feeling of stupidity kind of washed over me, because I realized I had never actually used the micro SD card to restore the firmware the way I had done so at the beginning of my talk. And so instead of trying the most obvious thing, I kind of went for the most complicated. When I turned the camera back on though, it booted fully. So the camera's security was still crap, but I mean, at least it turns on. Here's some of the things I learned by failing. I learned how to cross-compile. I understand now some of the nuances of compiling for like a constrained device, and in the future where IoT devices are gonna just multiply, I'm sure that'll come in handy, and I'm sure it'll get me in trouble then too. I learned how to mill PCBs and do other kind of laser engraving stuff at home, and this opens the doors for like tons and tons of projects. Using what I learned in this project, I was able to laser engrave my toothbrush with my name on it, which doesn't sound super useful until you realize that I bought 10 identical toothbrushes that I share with my girlfriend. I learned that you should Google all the things. There's a good chance somebody's been doing the same thing that you are trying to do, and you should learn from that. And I learned that you should chase rabbit holes. Let personal projects explode into huge, huge sagas. It'll hurt a little bit, it'll take more time, but you'll learn a ton doing so. And I learned to RTFM. I learned to read the docs and understand them. If I spent a little bit more time reading those terrible SDK docs, I would have actually learned that the bootloader checks the micro SD card for the firmware files, and then it would have updated the internal storage. And so reading documentation saves like tons of time, tons of effort, and I think it's a skill we can all get better at. And I learned to RFTM to reflash the micro SD card. Thanks so much for listening. I'm at the dev on Slack. I don't think there's time for questions, but feel free to Slack me if you have comments, insults. If you enjoyed this, a little bit of self-promo. I started a blog, thedev.ca. There's similar content there, so I'm probably going to post something that dives deeper into this. Yeah, and there's my laser engraved toothbrush. Thanks.